Thank you very much. I want to thank you for listening to me in just a minute, but I especially want to thank all of you for your community-wide efforts on behalf of Humbug Marsh and the Detroit River. In a moment, you'll be hearing a little sales pitch for a book I wrote about Michigan's environmental history, but I think it's really important to look at things from a historical perspective and realize that in 50 and 100 years from now, the work that you have done to protect the Detroit River is going to be remembered, celebrated, memorialized in some future environmental historian's book, because it really is critical to the rescue of this environment that we face. So I want to thank all of you, particularly my friends Bruce Jones, Blair McGowan, Don Griffin, and some others here who have really fought a valiant battle on behalf of these fragile resources. Okay. It's been a long day for all of you. You don't want to hear somebody lecture at you for a long period of time, so fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to run through a very dense presentation in a very short period of time so we can get to the dialogue, which is really what we're hoping to stimulate with presentations like this across the state. The first thing I'm going to do is talk specifically about our recent report, and I say our in the broadest sense because it's a coalition report called Continuing Dereliction of Duty. Then I'll be talking a little bit about the history of the Detroit River as it relates to the book that I mentioned. Finally, I'll be closing with a call for some assistance and action on a very acute toxic pollution problem that's affecting the Detroit River even as we speak. So, here's what the report. Here's the report. Whoop. I wonder what the. There. I'm a high-tech kind of guy, you can tell. We usually have a consultant help me with these things. This is the report that we issued last Thursday, February 8th. I brought along about 30 copies that are on this table underneath Leonard's pile there, and you're welcome to take them. As you can see, a broad coalition of environmental groups ranging from Clean Water Action to the Sisters of St. Joseph Office of Peace and Justice. Now, how unimpeachable are they? Participated in the drafting of this report. If you are interested in downloading a copy of the report off our website, if you go to the internet address at the top there, you can simply print out your own copy without having to pick up one tonight. And this is information about how to contact us with my email address.
Leave it up there.
Go ahead.
We're slow writers.
If you get on our website, the home page has at the bottom 3 items. In the middle at the bottom it says breaking news. You click on that and you'll see immediately the report come up and you can download it from there. Thanks to Bruce Jones, we headed the report with a quote from that very famous Republican conservationist Theodore Roosevelt. Here is your country. Do not let anyone take its glory away from you. Do not let selfish men, sexist but true, or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. The world and the future and your very children shall judge you according to the way you deal with this sacred trust.
That's the generic man.
Generic man, that's right. Here is the primary message of our report. As Blair mentioned, we issued the first dereliction of duty report last October. We were attacked by DEQ Director Russell Harding for what he said was our effort to politicize an issue before the election. Well, the timing of that report was coincidental, and just to show that our interest is not partisan but policy-based, we want to assure Mr. Harding we will be continuing to release these reports on a regular basis, regardless of any election cycle, because he's generating more than enough material, more than enough outrages that there will be reports aplenty. We are not going to go away. That's the basic message of this report. Here's a sample of what's in it. A roll call of communities across Michigan that are suffering because of specific DEQ decisions. Romulus, you're familiar with, overruling a public board in order to allow more hazardous waste to be imported into Michigan for disposal. Northport up by Traverse City. A judge actually had to intervene and overturn a DEQ wetland permit because the reasoning it was based on was absurd. In Rockwood, the landfill got a slap on the wrist for repeated violations of daily cover requirements. In Ludington, the DEQ looked at a wetland and decided it wasn't a wetland legally and has allowed it to be cleared for a golf course. Hamtramck, instead of cracking down on an incinerator that burns medical waste by requiring the operator to come into compliance with its permit, the DEQ is rewriting the permit to allow more pollution. That's just the beginning. It gets a little bit repetitive. Charlevoix, DEQ has reversed course there and granted a wetland development permit. Cadillac, citizens there are outraged because the DEQ is not requiring a tire burning facility to install air pollution equipment. They'll be allowing sulfur dioxide and mercury to go into the air without controls. Antrim County is now developing its own county-wide wetland ordinance because it doesn't trust the DEQ to protect wetlands in that county anymore. And in your area, Grosse Ile, another wetland has been defined out of existence in order to allow a development. Policies are also suffering in the state of Michigan. Communities are one thing, but policies are another. Just recently, Governor Engler in the Detroit Free Press of yesterday defended his environmental record and said things are getting better and better. And I won't bore you with all the statistics I brought along, but I do want to just highlight a couple of statistics that seem to belie the governor's contention about improving air and water quality. Number of exceedances of the federal smog standard in Michigan over 1997 and 98. A more long-term problem, the number of miles of Michigan, or percentage of Michigan rivers that are monitored that are violating water quality standards, in other words, too impaired for fishing or swimming, has gone up sharply in recent periods. And there is more recent data than this that we have not yet put on overheads that further confirms that trend. Communities are suffering, policies are suffering, and in the end, all of us are going to suffer. Okay, here's the quick commercial for my book. There's a blue handout sheet there in case you're interested. It's called Ruin and Recovery, Michigan's Rise as a Conservation Leader, and will be out in the spring. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Detroit River elements of the book because the Detroit River is a character in Michigan's environmental history. The worst era of environmental pollution visibly to the public, and some of you may recall it, was immediately after post-World War II. These are the conditions that sportsmen in Trenton found in downriver Detroit in 1947. I've watched the Detroit River change from one of the most beautiful rivers in the state of Michigan to the filthiest river in the United States, with the exception of the River Rouge, said the head of the local sportsman's club. Although his spelling wasn't too good, his passion was obvious. Pollution has increased to the extent that fish are no longer eatable, paint on the bottom of boats is eaten off, aquatic vegetation is diminished to the extent it's practically stopped. And swimming is a thing of the past. This is 1947. And then there was a major episode that caused public outrage because of the conditions in the Detroit River. In mid-January 1948, a thick oil flow coiled along the west side of the river, coating several thousand ducks. Some of them died quickly, and others were easy prey for predators. Because of their outrage about this gross oil pollution, the Michigan United Conservation Clubs organized a duck dump on the front walk of the Capitol in March 1948. We might want to keep that in mind for 2001. More than 1,500 dead ducks were laid out where legislators couldn't avoid them, right on the front walk to the Capitol. Governor Sigler viewed the ducks, and I have, I think, a picture of that you won't be able to see very clearly because it's on an overhead. Anyway, there's the governor, Governor Sigler. You can see the little sign there. It says 15,000 ducks dead from oil pollution on the Detroit River. Why do I mention this? Well, because in 1949, a year later, the legislature toughened our water pollution laws. Obviously, there was a lot more work to be done, but the legislature did respond. What about the environmental crisis of the late 60s and early 70s? In early March 1970, a graduate student from the University of Western Ontario collected 42 Lake St. Clair fish and sent them to a California laboratory for a research project. They found mercury. Levels were 6 to 8 parts per million in the fish, whereas the health standard was 0.5 parts per million. This was alarming because fish at Minamata, Japan had contained levels roughly in the same range, slightly higher. And in 1968, a chemical company there had acknowledged its mercury discharges were responsible for the death and deformity of 111 persons who had consumed the fish. This will be relevant to the current situation in just a second, as you'll see. Mercury is a concern then and now because it attacks the brain and central nervous system and can affect speech, hearing, and motor skills. It's persistent bioaccumulative. It builds up and does not degrade in the environment. Therefore, even small discharges can cause big problems. One of the major sources discovered of mercury to the Detroit River at that time was Wyandotte Chemical Company was sending 10 to 20 pounds of mercury daily into the Detroit River, which is an unthinkable amount of mercury these days. The company wanted 16 months to phase out the mercury discharge, and the state insisted that the company immediately stop the discharge. And Governor Milliken had to issue an executive order to ban fishing, to ban people from actually fishing and catching fish on the St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair. What about 2001? What's going on with the Detroit River? Dioxin is discharging into the Detroit River from the BASF Riverview disposal site. As I understand it, that's just downriver from the old BASF Southworks facility in Wyandotte. The level found in the groundwater immediately adjacent to the river is 3,000 times above the state safety standard. It's a result of dumping at the disposal site of waste from the old Southworks facility. The state standard for the discharge of dioxin, one of the most potent chemicals known to humans, is 0.01 parts per trillion. And the results from 4 of the 5 test wells, 1 had no detectable dioxin. The remainder are showing levels that are thousands of times beyond the acceptable standard. Dioxin is being discharged into the Detroit River in 2001. I have the numbers in a press release, which I'll be handing out in a second. I think it's fair to say that this site is one of the leading current sources of mercury and dioxin contamination of the Detroit River, and one of the current biggest point source discharges of these 2 chemicals in the entire Great Lakes ecosystem. We do have mercury and dioxin entering from other pathways through the air, principally from incineration of both medical and municipal waste, but this is a point source. If this was a factory discharging this level of dioxin or mercury today, it would be shut down immediately, but because it's an old disposal site that's leaking contamination of the river, it's continuing. What's the BASF plan? Well, they want to wait at least 18 months before they stop the discharge, and even then it's doubtful whether they are going to take an aggressive action. As I mentioned, there's also significant mercury and PCB discharges well above health standards at this site, again from disposal of waste. And these discharges pose substantial risks to the river's recovery, as well as the health of fish, and it can threaten human health by contaminating sport fish downstream of the discharge. It's a quote from our president, Lana Pollock, head of the MEC. Most citizens think this kind of pollution stopped years ago, but chemical contamination of the Detroit River is more than history. It's happening every day at this site, and there are others, historical sites, discharging toxic chemicals above the health standards up and down the Detroit River. The state has to insist that this stop now. So, what can you do? I think the most important thing for you to do is probably the most important person to contact is the DEQ director, Russell Harding, at the address indicated on this overhead. I would also encourage you to write your local state senator, Chris Dingell, and your state representatives and urge them to ask the DEQ to take aggressive action to correct this problem. I want to hand out, just so you can, for those of you who are interested, if I can find it, oh, here it is. A press release that summarizes these facts that I just gave you about the pollution of the river. So, let me summarize and then open it to questions. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality is not harming our environment by accident. This is a conscious, concerted plan to turn Michigan over to the interests of developers and industrial barons. We all want jobs, and we want economic prosperity in the state, but we long ago learned that we can't have prosperity at the expense of our environment. It must go hand in hand with our environment. What I am hoping for is that by releasing this report and the sequel that I'm sure will be coming out in 2 months, because I've already received 4 phone calls from communities around the state that want to be included in the next study, is to spark a prairie fire that will sweep across this state and will lead to reform of the State Department of Environmental Quality. What are the chances of that, you say? having watched some of the most bizarre political events in our history in the last year, I think our chances are really good. As I showed you, in 1948, long before the environmental era of the 60s and 70s, downriver sportsmen were able to force the legislature to correct gross pollution by shaming them through dumping ducks on the Capitol walkway into changing our laws. Surely we, today, in this era, with the numbers and the passion that you represent and other communities across the state represent, can do at least as well, can fix the DEQ, or if necessary, abolish it and replace it with a new agency whose primary mission is protection not only of our environment today, but our environment for future generations. So with that, I will, I guess, open it up to questions.